I'm Greg Corombos, and welcome to this special edition of Veterans Chronicles. 10 years ago, on February 27, 2011, America lost its last veteran of World War I, when Frank Buckles died at the age of 110 at his farm in West Virginia. Mr. Buckles not only remained mentally sharp and physically fit for a man of his advanced age, but he was also a tireless advocate, teaching others about the First World War and pushing for a national World War I memorial on the Washington, D.C. Mall. In May of 2007, Buckles served as an honorary marshal in the National Memorial Day Parade. Just hours before that event, in which he was loudly cheered by thousands of spectators along Constitution Avenue, Mr. Buckles spent some time telling me about his amazing life. Frank Buckles was born in February of 1901. The 20th century was just dawning. William McKinley was president. His life began in the heartland of America, which gave him something in common with his hero, who was also commander of American forces in the First World War.
On my father's farm north of Bethany in Harrison County, Missouri. And when I met General John Joseph Pershing, he asked me where was I born. When I told him, he said, just 43 miles as a crow flies from Lynn County, where I was born. So we were fellow Missourians.
When Buckles was 13 years old, World War I broke out in Europe. We may be able to watch war play out minute by minute today, but back then, of course, there was no television or radio or certainly internet to help him follow events. Nonetheless, Mr. Buckles was engrossed by the war coverage in his local newspaper.
Papers were all full of the events of the war. I could read about what was happening in Europe, the war we had in Mexico, right up to date.
As the next couple of years played out, Americans were drawn ever closer to the side of the Allies after German U-boats sank the Lusitania and unrestricted submarine warfare threatened many passenger vessels in the Atlantic Ocean. Finally, in 1917, after learning of a German attempt to draw Mexico into war with our country, the United States declared war on Germany. Unlike some members of future generations who worked feverishly to avoid serving in wartime, for Frank Buckles, the decision was an easy one.
Well, why wasn't it important? It was a world event, something I was interested in. Everybody was talking about it.
At age 16, Buckles tried to enlist, but was turned away by several recruiters for being underage. Since pretending to be 18 wasn't working, he told the next recruiter he was 21, and his military service officially began.
I enlisted in the regular army on the 14th of August, 1917. I had been advised by one of the older sergeants that the way to get to France quickly was to go into the ambulance corps, because the French were begging for ambulance service. I went from Fort Logan, Colorado, to Fort Riley, Kansas, where I was trained, intensive training in trench warfare.
By the time America started fighting, France was weary from waging war for more than 3 years, all of it on its own soil. The massive casualties on their side led the French to label their battered heroes as the lost generation. According to Buckles, the French and their British allies were deadlocked against a persistent enemy, and both countries were very happy to see the Yanks arrive.
When I arrived in Europe, I felt that it was a very severe situation. We were welcomed in Britain, we were welcomed in France, but it was a serious situation. They were happy to see the Americans, both the British and the French. And the feeling was that here was a relief to have some younger people coming in to help.
Of course, we know now the entrance of U.S. forces made a decisive difference towards the Allied victory, and Buckles gave much of the credit to the strong leadership of General John Pershing.
He was the leader, no question about it, in every way. It was reflected in the men, realized that he was a tough character, yes.
Finally, at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns fell silent. The armistice took effect, and the killing finally stopped.
It seemed to be a relief to everybody. I didn't find that people were so jubilant. It was more of a relief to them that the war had ended.
For Mr. Buckles and the other World War I veterans, it was exceedingly difficult to see the peace following the war violated just 2 decades later. For Frank Buckles, World War II would be excruciating, even though he was no longer in uniform. By the late 1930s, Buckles was working for a steamship company, and the outbreak of war in Europe meant shifting many of the shipping routes to the Far East, including the Philippines, where the company already did plenty of business. But when Japanese forces went on the rampage in the Philippines, Mr. Buckles could not escape the brutality.
I was living in Manila when the World War II started, when the Japanese invaded the Philippines. I was in a prison camp, San Tomas for 1 year and 2 years and more in Los Baños. 3.5 years in Japanese prison camps. I'm one of the few who survived.
3.5 years in the horror of Japanese prison camps. So how did Frank Buckles emerge as one of the few fortunate survivors?
Physical condition, a determination to live, keeping myself in good shape as possible, as much as possible.
After being rescued from the prison camp, Buckles returned to the United States, got married, and raised a daughter. And in the mid-1950s, he purchased the 330-acre farm that kept him busy until his final days. But of course, he had plenty of time for reflection. Given all the amazing advancements in all areas of life since his birth, he couldn't quite put his finger on the most significant area of progress, but he said it's easy to narrow the list at least a little bit.
Well, it isn't a television.
There was also plenty of correspondence. Buckles said the letters he received from soldiers engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan at that time showed the same patriotism, devotion to duty, and belief in the rightness of their cause that he felt 90 years earlier. In the end, Frank Buckles remained very proud of his service, and the service of others in his generation to this country in World War I. The lingering regret, however, is that the peace following that war failed to last.
Well, there was a feeling that was a war to end all wars, hoping that their problems could be settled some other way. I think that most, as the veteran of World War I, felt quite disturbed when there was another war, when it became involved in another war.
Frank Buckles was the last of the World War I generation. But his humble dignity and plain-spoken friendliness served as a reminder of the great Americans who did so much to build this nation, and of those from every generation throughout our history who have answered the call and served this nation in uniform during its hour of need. It was an honor to know him and to learn his incredible story. America is a better place because of his service. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Corombos, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features, and of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.